Hi there, welcome to this video where I'm going to talk to you about camera settings. Now recently I've been getting quite a few comments asking me about the settings that I use when taking certain images. Now this might be because I've not put the settings on the top of the screen for some of the videos when I didn't think it was really appropriate, but this has led me to realise that there's still lots of people that are confused by the camera settings. So if you're new to photography or just getting into it, I can understand how all of the different buttons and all of the numbers can be very confusing. It's not intuitive straight away, and they all have different effects on the way that your final image looks. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk you through some of my tips, and hopefully by the end of it you'll have a better idea of how to choose the right settings for yourself. So stay tuned, because I know that I'm really going to help you to enjoy your photography. So if you are new to the channel or haven't yet clicked like, subscribe and the bell notifications, go ahead and do that now, because that way you'll stay up to date with everything that I release in the future. Lots more photography content coming your way. Now, choosing the right settings is probably one of the most difficult things to get your head around when you first start photography, because there's so many buttons and getting the image right is very difficult, and quite often people just leave their camera in automatic mode. Now I'm going to come on to that in a little while, and I actually think there is a value in that as well. But I understand how frustrating it can be when you're new to photography, because it just seems so complicated. If you're watching this video though, expecting me to say that you need to use a certain setting and that's going to be great for every photograph, then unfortunately that is not going to be the case, because your settings will change for every single photograph that you take. Now there are some rules that you can apply that will act as guidance, but there's no hard and fast one single setting that you can use for every single photograph. So choosing the correct settings are determined by two things. Firstly, the available light that you have. So if it's darker, you've got to let more light into the camera to make your image brighter, and if it's very bright, obviously you've got to make the image darker, so it's always balanced and not too bright and not too dark, and that is what we call good exposure. Now the second thing that you might want to consider when choosing your settings is the effect that you want to get. Now I'm going to talk a lot more about effects that you can get from changing the settings later in this video. Knowing the settings that were used to take an image is only really any use to know what settings were used as that shot was taken. And so as an example, this shot here of this robin was taken fairly close to me. It was only about 5 or 6 feet away from me on the path in front of me, and it wasn't moving very much, so I managed to use a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, but I was able to use an aperture of 7.1, which gave me quite a good depth of field, which made sure that all of the robin was nice and sharp and in focus. But when I took this picture of these swans, I needed completely different settings. For this, I changed the shutter speed to 1/6400th of a second, because I needed to freeze the action of the birds in flight, and also I was taking the shot up into the sky, which is a lot brighter. So you can see from these two photographs that I've used wildly different settings for different reasons, so it would be impossible to give you one single setting that would cover everything that you want to take. It's all about choosing the appropriate settings for the photography that you want. So if you are new to photography, I can understand just how difficult it must be to understand these complicated terms like ISO and aperture and shutter speed. But what I've done is I have made a video that explains all the mechanics of these things using visual aids. So what I'll do is I'll put a link for that down below in the description. So if at the end of this video you're still not sure about that kind of thing, go and check that out. But very basically, there are three things that control the amount of light that comes into the camera, and what you want to do is use those settings to create what is called a good exposure, and that's an image that's not too bright and not too dark. And the first thing is the aperture, and basically in the front of the camera lens there is a hole that opens and closes, and this is known as the iris, and this lets more or less light in. The bigger the hole, the more light that comes in. The smaller the hole, the less light comes in. The second thing that you need to control the amount of light that comes into the camera is the shutter speed, and basically you can think of this as a set of curtains. They open and let light in, and then they close and stop the light from coming in, and the longer the curtains are open, the more light comes in, and then they shut and stop the light from coming in. Now it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's a fairly good analogy. And the final thing that is going to make a difference to how much light the camera records is the ISO, and this is something that is a bit like a volume control on a microphone. If the volume is too quiet, you don't hear as much. If you turn the volume up, it gets louder, and it's similar with a picture. If it's too dark, you turn up the ISO and it gets brighter, and that's a very simple layman's explanation of how ISO works. And again, it's obviously more complicated than that, but that's a fairly good way of thinking about it. So full automatic is pretty self-explanatory. It does what it says on the tin. The camera takes control of getting a good exposure. Now, I will admit that sometimes I do actually use full automatic. So if I'm in a situation, say on holiday, and I don't have time to spend lots of time fiddling with settings, I will leave the camera in full automatic mode. So I might just walk past something that's interesting and take a quick snap, and I just know that I'm going to get a fairly decent picture, and I don't have to think about it, because at that time I'm focusing on having a good holiday, and so I don't want to be thinking about messing about with my camera. So full automatic can be relied upon most of the time to give you a good exposure, but the camera is basically a little computer, and it's only as good as the software that it was programmed with, and it can't really make any of its own decisions on creative choices. It just does what it thinks is going to be the best to give you a good exposure, and sometimes it does get it wrong. Now, your second option, which does give you lots more creativity, is to use one of the semi-automatic exposure modes. Now, usually every camera has at least two of these. Usually they are shutter priority, or if you've got a Canon, that will be TV, which stands for time value, and aperture priority, which on a Canon is AV, aperture value. And basically what happens with these modes is you choose either the shutter speed or the aperture, and then the camera makes all the other decisions to balance up the exposure to give you a correctly exposed image. Now, the first option that I mentioned was shutter priority. Now, it's important to understand the effects you get from different shutter speeds. So if you've got a very slow shutter speed, which means the shutter is open for a long time, it's going to let more light in. But if an object is moving within the frame, then that object is going to blur. Now, this might be an effect that you particularly want. For instance, if you were taking photographs of running water and you want to blur it out and make it smooth, or you were taking pictures in a crowded place and you wanted to get the people that were moving blurred out, which creates an interesting effect, then you would need a slow shutter speed. But on the other side, if you've got things that you want to freeze because they are fast moving, so for instance birds in flight or motor vehicles or something like that that were moving, then you would need a fast shutter speed, because the shutter stays open for a very, very small fraction of a second, and so this has the effect of freezing the action so it's completely sharp and no motion in it at all. The second option is aperture priority. Now, this is the option that I use most of the time for most of my images. Certainly when I'm taking wildlife images, my camera is nearly always in aperture priority, because basically with this mode I can control the size of the aperture, and the camera then does all the rest to make sure I get a good exposure. But the reason that I choose this mode is changing the size of the aperture will change how much of the image is in focus. So if you've got a very wide open aperture, that's a big hole, then you don't have very much of the image in focus. So if I've got a picture of a bird in the foreground, the background will be out of focus. Now, if I'm alternatively doing landscape photography and I want all of the image from front right into the distance in focus, then I need a smaller aperture. So I might take the aperture down to something like f11 or f14 even, and that will give me a larger amount in focus, and this is what's known as depth of field. So depth of field is the amount of the image that is acceptably sharp. The next setting to consider is ISO. Now, if you think of my analogy earlier that it is similar to the gain on a microphone, if you turn up the gain on a microphone, then towards the top end, the sound coming from the microphone will start to distort as it breaks up. And a similar thing does happen with the image that you get if you start to lift the ISO. Now, it's okay at the lower ranges, but as you get towards the higher ranges of ISO, then you start to get noise appearing in your image, which is lots of little dots, and it gets very grainy, which can really degrade the quality of your image. So you've got to be a little bit careful when using ISO, and different cameras do different jobs at introducing or not introducing noise. So it's all about finding out the acceptable levels that you can go to with your camera. And usually with my images, I'm quite happy to take my ISO up to at least 2000, and then if there are any noise artifacts that are introduced, I use noise reduction software to remove that noise afterwards. The final mode that you can choose is full manual. Now, this is not really for the faint-hearted, and it does require you to have a fairly good understanding of the effects that you get from changing the shutter speed, aperture and ISO. But it can be really valuable to put the camera into full manual mode when you're learning just to play about with the different settings, because very quickly you'll get a feel for the effects you get from changing the settings. If you do choose to go into full manual mode, the camera has ways to help you make the correct decisions on the settings. You're not just stabbing in the dark or making wild guesses at the settings. The first thing to look for is the meter. Now, this will either be in the viewfinder or it will appear on the screen on the back of the camera, and it's usually made up of a lot of little lines with one line that moves backwards and forwards. And what you're trying to do is get that line that moves backwards and forwards right in the middle, because if it's over to one side it's going to be too bright, if it's over to the other side it's going to be too dark. So the good exposure is in the middle. Now, the second thing that you can use is your histogram. Now, some cameras will display this as you're taking the shot, and some will only display after the shot has been taken. But I'll put some examples of histograms here. So if you look at the histogram at the top, this one, all of the peaks are over to the left hand side, and the left hand side are where all the dark tones are. So this image is underexposed. The one at the bottom, all of the peaks are over to the right hand side, which is where the white parts of the image are, and so this one is overexposed. Now, what you really ideally want to get is the histogram looking like the one in the middle. So all of the peaks on the histogram are in the middle of the image, so there's none hanging off the white end or none hanging off the black end, and then you get a good exposure. So I hope that video has been useful for you. Unfortunately, there's no magic bullet for the camera settings one setting doesn't fix all. It's important for you to get used to what each setting does and choose the correct one that's appropriate for the style of photography that you want to take or the lighting conditions that you have on the day. And don't forget, there's nothing wrong with using the semi-automatic modes, because I use aperture priority probably 90% of the time when I'm out shooting wildlife, and even when I'm doing landscapes as well. And certainly if I was taking photographs where time was a factor, it's much better to use a semi-automatic mode because the camera takes care of all of the rest. Well, if you have enjoyed this video, do let me know down below in the comments, or nip over to my Vero account, that's @DeOaktonPhotography. Leave me a comment there, and you can also see lots of my photographs. Now, if you like what I do on the channel and want to help support me to make future content like this, you can also visit my Teespring store. There I've got a range of merchandise on offer, so head over there, check it out, because a purchase really does help me out and it's very much appreciated. And also, don't forget the super thanks button as well. But you don't have to spend any money at all to support the channel. You can do that simply by clicking like, subscribe and the bell notifications, because it really helps me out and it makes sure that you don't miss out on any future content. Watch out for next week's video, that goes live on Sunday. In the meantime, go and check out this video just up here. But all that's left now is to say, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.